Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And in the last few episodes, we've been looking at Matthew chapter 19, and in particular, the part of Matthew chapter 19 that has Jesus talking about divorce and remarriage and gender, and even, as strange as it might sound, eunuchs and how people become eunuchs and what that meant and what the spiritual implications and church implications and marriage implications were in the first century. As I have said, I think in every single episode of this conversation, I totally get that the Venn diagram has a pretty big shaded area here between this passage and very sensitive, very delicate, very serious issues that people are wrestling with and discussing and debating in this day and age. But the assumptions of the original audience in hearing these topics come up would have looked nothing like the assumptions that would come to mind if this were written today or if this were delivered to an audience here and now. So for us, the big question is, what does marriage mean? Why is God so concerned with it? It looks like it's more than a societal construct that God has put in place to make it so that people who are in love and have been intimate with somebody else don't go around and murder other people because all relationships are open. I think it's more than just order and sanity construct in society. It looks like there's theological meaning to it as well, and that is evident in the two passages we've looked at regarding marriage that are somewhat parallel passages in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5 of Matthew, where we've got the business about Jesus saying, "It's been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." And then you bounce over to 19, and Jesus gives effectively the same teaching in verses 8 and 9 after being jabbed by the Pharisees who were like, well, why did Moses allow people to get divorced, and why was a certificate of divorce allowed? And so Jesus is speaking to the same scenario in both of these places. There was a wickedness and a hardness of heart that is described at the end of the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Malachi. And in all of these things we're looking at, whether it's Deuteronomy 24, where the whole divorce idea is introduced in the first place, whether it's Malachi, whether it's Jesus' teachings in Matthew 5 or Matthew 19, they all point to this idea that there's a theological reality here that is bigger. And I think that theological reality exists on two planes. One is that a lot of the assumptions behind the biblical teachings on marriage start with the idea that the union with God is the most important thing. Union with God is that which transcends this life. And the second one is this idea of incredible intimacy and closeness, and how the model or the picture of the most intimate relationship we can imagine amongst humans somehow points to this union with God and gives us a little bit of a picture of what that looks like. Now, when we run into that kind of language, it's really easy to put on our 21st century brains, our, how would that fly on Twitter brains, and be offended by some of the language and almost want to dismiss it as, well, it's archaic. People had wrong views about men and women and everything back then, and that's something that we can dismiss culturally. I don't think you want to do that necessarily, though, because read in context, and I think read with honesty and apart from our political bickering, this description of marriage is really appealing. Even the parts that on the surface, the language might clang for us with our modern minds. 1 Corinthians 7 is one of these two passages I'm talking about. Of course, 1 Corinthians is written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Corinth that he helped put there. And 1 and 2 Corinthians both, Paul's a little unhappy with how things are turning out there. And so these are corrective letters. And from time to time, that corrective language flares a little bit more than others. So here he's trying to straighten out something that apparently has become weird regarding marriage and choosing to remain unmarried. And remember, in our last conversation, we talked about the fact that it looks like most Christians took Jesus' words to mean that he would be like right back, just stay there for a minute. We're going to do this reckoning thing, eventually, but first just go tell some people. And I think that was a misunderstanding of what Jesus said, but it was an honest misunderstanding born out of how eager people were to see Jesus again and to experience it at an even deeper level, the stuff that you and I have been reading about in Matthew. So that's what I think is going on here. Remember that as I read this text, this question about should I marry or not, that I think implicitly is attached to the idea of is it even worth it time-wise? I mean, shouldn't we just be getting ready? 1 Corinthians 7:1. Now for the matters you wrote about. Okay, so right off the bat, we're learning that we're only getting half of the conversation here. There's a letter that is lost to history that must have been written to Paul, or maybe multiple parties in the church are like, we don't really know what to do on this issue, but it's causing us problems. Can you help us out? So he's responding to that. It is good for a man not to marry. Oh, okay. So all the people are like, yeah, I knew we shouldn't get married. They're probably cheering as that gets read out loud in church. But since there's so much immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife and likewise the wife to her husband. So now as that's being read in church, I'm guessing a lot of the people who are married are like, see, I told you, this is a good idea. And probably, some husbands and wives kind of fist bumped each other and winked a little bit right there. That's right, marital duty. Verse 4, the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Now, obviously, if you skip the second half of verse 4, this sounds really sexist and mean, like some kind of thing where now the husband owns the wife. It's ridiculous. But if you read the whole verse, I mean, you don't even have to read the whole context. It's all there in one verse. Verse 4 has this thing reflexively go in both directions. The idea here is this beautiful picture of mutual submission, of taking half of who you are, really all of who you are, and connecting it permanently to another person. What a beautiful image of commitment and intimacy and trust at a level that you just can't get anywhere else. I mean, at this point, all of the successes of the other person becomes your successes and all of their failures are your failures to help own and bear together. This is beautiful, not backwards language at all. Don't deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Okay, I think I see what's going on here. At the beginning, he says, now for the matters you wrote about. Oh, well, we're trying to figure out what did they write about, right? Well, it looks like whatever they wrote to Paul, it must have included some language about some people are really wanting to have the sex and other people are feeling like sex is maybe weird and compromised and too self-indulgent and maybe there was some degree of sexual chaos going on within the church community that was making it tough to do church right or to share life the right way. It sounds like there was some kind of problem that was born out of this that was theologically attached to confusion over the timeline as to when Jesus is coming back and if it even makes sense to get married at all. Add to that the Corinthian church is deeply seated in Greek thought. It's in Greece. And, well, Greek Christianity is the number one place where the Gnostic threads of Christianity caught on. These are the versions of Christianity that tried to meld certain assumptions about Greek thought with certain assumptions about Jesus. And so the idea here in Gnosticism is, the spiritual is good, the physical is bad. This is a gross oversimplification. And so sex and sexuality become a confusing point of contention for a lot of these Greekified Christians in the early going. Because they're like, well, what do we do then? Should we, since the body is less important than the spiritual, according to our Greek philosophical roots, should we reject anything that makes us feel good and sleep on rocks? Or since the spiritual is what matters more, it doesn't matter what we do with our bodies. And both of these extremes manifested, and a lot of what we get after the Gospels and Acts in the New Testament, especially the stuff that's written to the Greek churches, seems to be devoted to trying to correct these two abuses. Indeed, 1 John, that you and I talk about a lot on here, is certainly devoted to straightening that out. I want to finish this passage, and I also want to unpack one more. So I'm going to hit pause right there, and we'll just pick it up right where we left off tomorrow and finish up our thinking about this whole marriage and divorce and theology and how it all fits together and why Jesus is bringing it up thing. Very last thing on the way out the door, I just launched a very weird, very different podcast. It's called Ironwood Rhino, and it is a podcast where I bring people in and let them talk about their strangest, weirdest outlier stories. But then we use those stories to think about thinking, to think about how we know what's true and what's not true. And you guys are smart. If you've been here and you've been listening to this, I think you're tracking with what I'm going for and where I'm coming from. And it will not take you more than a couple of episodes of this new Ironwood Rhino podcast to connect the dots with what the long-term goal is there. Whether you have time for that or not, I am so grateful that we get to do this together. More on the marriage thing mañana. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.